warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Since you're here, let me ask you, have you liked the video and subscribed to Bharata First? If no, then please do so now. It is up to you to spread the word about this platform so that more people get to know about us. Do subscribe to our newsletter as well to get some incisive information. And how can I not tell you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center? It is your one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. We now have 26 amazing courses all put together to help you in your competitive exams and also make you better Bharatiyas. Live classes for the second phase have begun. Do ensure that you register now and participate in the interactive sessions. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com for more details. Many candidates who cleared UPSC CSE this year have thanked Bharata First and the Knowledge Center for playing a big part in their success. So don't be left behind and don't regret later. Register now at kc.bharatafirst.com. You can also download the Bharata First app. It's an interactive app that has a lot of quizzes and other material that will help you gain more knowledge. And all of this, of course, is for your consumption benefit, and it is free. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. Well, now on to the discussion. External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar joined counterparts from the United States, Japan, and host Australia at the meeting of Quad foreign ministers in Melbourne on Friday to send a clear signal to Beijing, underlying their pursuit of a shared vision to uphold a rules-based international order free from coercion, one based on respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. But after the meeting, Jaishankar took a slightly nuanced position in public than the three other foreign ministers, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Australian Foreign Minister Marise, Payne, and Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi, on at least two important issues: the Russia-Ukraine row and the Myanmar issue. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the Quad foreign ministers meet in Australia and what's wrong with the Quad, what needs to be done to further strengthen it. Joining me on the program today are Manjeev Puri, former ambassador, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Pramit, let me start the program with you first. Let's try and analyze the key takeaways really as far as the Quad meeting that was held in Australia is concerned. There was a lot of noise, especially before the meet, from the Chinese side. And, how would you look at that?
Well, the Chinese side will automatically take the most umbrage at any Quad meeting for the obvious reason that the implicit purpose of the Quad is to counter Chinese influence in the region. While the Indo-Pacific is officially states that it is not aimed at any specific country, it's understood that these four countries are fundamentally attempting to at least contain the degree of Chinese economic and technological influence more than anything else over the coming decade, because all of these four countries in the Quad have a problem, if you wish, with Chinese assertiveness over the past decade or so. So the Chinese response, I don't think, is an issue, is a surprise, should we say. They have been repeatedly against it. I think the question for the Quad really is that it still has to deliver on something, and that's what this foreign ministers meeting was really, I believe, my understanding is very focused on, that you still need to come through with your promise on COVID vaccines, even though COVID may be starting to wane among the four countries of the Quad and in the Indo-Pacific as a whole. We still have to come through on that promise. There was, I believe, a very strong rebuff of attempts by America in particular to try to get the Quad to look at other non-Indo-Pacific issues, notably the Ukraine crisis. And I think what I understand is that the other members said that, look, let's get something done in the Indo-Pacific before we start to wander off to other parts of the world, which we don't really have a dog in the fight, if you wish. But the real difficult part of the Quad remains on the, I would argue, on the technology side. If you see what the Quad laid out in its previous summits, it laid out a position of trying to be, if you wish, an independent source of technological solutions for the 21st century. Because in many ways, what the Quad is really about is that the future of geopolitical, if you wish, conflict or a struggle is going to be who dominates things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, pharmaceuticals, green hydrogen, the whole list of these technologies. And that requires us, the Quad, to work with non-Quad countries as well, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam. And so I think, therefore, you still continue to see the Quad holding to its argument that it's a Quad plus format. It is not a military agreement, because if it was a military agreement, a lot of these other countries would run away. But this is going to be about the technology. So that's still moving very slowly, and I would expect it to move slowly. That's not a surprise. But I think overall, the foreign ministers meeting, should we say, ensured that the Quad remained focused on its core competences and recognized that it needs to still deliver before it can be seen as a genuinely credible organization, especially in the eyes of China.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ambassador, here's where I'd like to bring you in. Are you happy with the way things have progressed as far as Quad is concerned?
Frank, first, let me just say, you know now why Pramit is the foreign affairs editor of one of India's leading dailies. No one could have put it as well as what he did. And that's absolutely spot on. Look, you know, let me take 30 seconds just to do something which is perhaps a little divergent. Simultaneously, if you note, during the time of the Quad summit, this AUKUS was announced. So in a sense, you know, some people can turn around and say that the real ability to sting was taken away. But on the other hand, you can also say the sting was taken away. And so now you are focusing on things which will really determine the future, technology led. Now, you very rightly said that, you know, COVID, the problem is that at the moment, for many people, it seems like, oh, yesterday's affair. But even that you haven't delivered. So these things will have to go forward. I would just leave one other point here. You know, we shouldn't forget the fact that the meeting has taken place just as when the entire matter in Europe, this Ukraine business is really at its height. And in fact, if you see the international channels, almost all the conversations of Tony Blinken in Melbourne were all about Ukraine and what's happening there, including announcing that the attack is going to take place in 24 hours. So these are facts that you can't. So, you know, in a sense, it is getting your friends together, even if the friends say, no, we don't have a dog in the game, but that's fine. You know, the friends are there. So these are things that have to note. Remember also, there is this French business with Australia, the submarines, again, this AUKUS and so on and so forth. So having said all this, you know, I believe this is a very good coming together of countries which have a capacity. And I mean not just economic capacity, but which have technological capacities, and more than that, going forward would have some ability. So the entire question in the Indo-Pacific, which let me tell you, is not the poorest of reasons. It's a place which is going places. There's ASEAN. I mean, come on, there's no way we sitting in India can call them poor. There is, and that's the real crux of, you know, what Indo-Pacific really comes. The small island states, they may be small, but, you know, they are fairly well off in various ways. So given all of this, the issues of geopolitics, you know, loom very large. And the question of, you know, I would even go to the extent of saying hemming in China. That's important. Making them play by the rules, keeping them straitjacketed, it's important. And then finally, if I may just tell you, whether journalists brought it up or busybodies brought it up, or it's really a fact, I don't know. Do you recall that some of the statements, the analysis going around at the time when this meeting was actually happening was that Russia into Ukraine, and then China looks towards its small, you know, the country which broke away, whether it's one China or not. And finally, I'll make one more point. Do look at the Russia-China joint statement and its mention of a few things, that there are no limits to our cooperation. Nothing is forbidden, and forbidden was put in inverted commas. I think these are things that we need to learn, we need to understand, and therefore look at it. So, there is geopolitics, but this is a coming together of those with capacities, with democracy at their heart, and to, say, of course, very strongly that we are also in the game. So that signaling, I think, should not be underestimated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor, let me bring you in, let me take the point that the ambassador was making forward with you, from a geopolitical point of view, what are really the challenges as far as the Quad is concerned?
I think the fundamental challenge during this second incarnation of four countries coming together, having four foreign ministers dialogues and going to have the third leaders summit, is unison. There is no clear unity when it comes to what is their vision and where they wish to take Quad, in achieving what objectives. In their first online leaders summit in March last year, they had promised about 1.3 billion jabs, doses of vaccines to be distributed around the Indo-Pacific littoral. In the yesterday's meeting of foreign ministers, they are saying about 500 billion have been distributed, and now the word being used is distribution around the world, not around Indo-Pacific. And as mention was made, each country apparently is pulling its own kind of tune into these meetings. For example, Antony Blinken was interested to bring the focus on Ukraine crisis. Japan was perhaps wanting to focus on North Korea. Host Australia would like to see that there are minimum variations in the joint statement and of course in the press conference. India was happy to see mention of language that alludes to China and Pakistan and Myanmar and Afghanistan. So what is the common united vision of the Quad for Indo-Pacific? What is the united vision that they have? And what are actionable, 1, 2, 3, 4 things, and with deadlines as they wish to achieve on, the ensuring, as we underline, that indirectly it is all meant to keep certain restraint on China, rule of law, fair play, etc., etc. Look at China's engagement with this whole littoral, and look at these four countries united. Individually, they may be connected. United connectivity or initiatives in securing, keeping open, inclusive, prosperous, etc. Indo-Pacific region. So creating a narrative of Indo-Pacific geopolitics is fine, and they have moved forward in saying that we need to look at Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans now in unison, in confluence. But what they want to do with that confluence is even the geographical divisions are not yet clear. Even the nomenclature, I mean, we still don't know whether it is to be called a grouping or to be called a framework or to be called a dialogue. What is Quad? In that sense of clarity on what it is, clarity on where they want to go, and unison in their voice and focus. And the United States is, of course, in that sense, engaged in the entire world in various crises. But when it comes to sit in Quad meetings, does it still want to push agenda for Ukraine, or is it something that we need to now, as Indian Foreign Minister said, focus on geographies? We are talking of Indo-Pacific here. So there is, a sense of half glass full, not that they have not achieved anything. They have kind of outlined about a dozen plus sectors, mostly in development sectors and traditional, non-traditional security sectors where they want to work together. But mostly, if you allow me to use a blunt language, joint statement is a wish list. And we need to see action happening on the ground. We need to see timelines and deadlines and what is it they want to do, especially if they wish to put restraint on China. If they want to just keep it as a talking shop, fantastic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very valid points there made. I'm going to take those points forward with the other panelists as well. Firstly, it's an issue that has been touched upon by both the other panelists, Manjipuri as well as Varan Singh, Pramit, the issue of, Ukraine coming up. And even though India stayed clear or steered clear of the entire Ukraine issue because we don't want to get involved in that matter, because Russia is a strategic partner at the end of the day as well. But we were seen on a platform where it was raked up, where it was, vociferously brought up as well, at least by one of the partners. So is this going to be a problem area really as far as India is concerned?
No, not really. I mean, the idea that any government that goes to a multilateral grouping will try to raise its own issues. It's like we raise Pakistan and terrorism at almost every agenda we can, because if we're lucky, other guys will say, yes, okay, that's a problem. And then we score a point. Everybody comes to the table with a set of their own issues, and they try to see if they can persuade the other countries to sign up. I would argue that's just the normal game in diplomacy. And so that's not a surprise that America should raise Ukraine, because obviously that's top of their mind right now. We would raise Myanmar and Pakistan because that's on the top of our head. Australia might raise some issues in the South Pacific, which America did respond to. I believe they're opening an embassy in Solomon Islands, for example. And Japan would raise North Korea. I don't see that as being an issue. The issue for me is never about the secondary things that people bring to any plurilateral or meeting, because that's just, I would argue, standard diplomatic action. And they wait to see if somebody will pick that up. The real issue is the core agenda moving forward. And the Quad will be particularly difficult because the core agenda is fundamentally about technology coalitions that are designed to provide an alternative to China. These coalitions are very difficult to put together because the Quad does not necessarily have control over these coalitions. What I'm getting now, and which is where I would disagree with Dr. Singh, is that in fact a large number of countries are now looking to us. I know the South Koreans have approached the Quad and said, for example, we are not interested in getting into a coalition against China, but your coalition on semiconductors, your coalition on green shipping, your coalition on artificial intelligence, we're interested. We wouldn't mind joining this. Taiwan has come in and said, semiconductors, we're the biggest players on the boundaries. If the Quad is interested, we would be happy to join. I was at a lunch with the prime minister of a European country, which I won't mention, a European country. And she said, would we be interested in my country joining some of the elements of the Quad? And everywhere I go, I see a large number of countries quietly coming up to the Quad and saying, we don't want to be part of an anti-China coalition, but there is elements of what you are doing that interest us. And we'd be very happy to support this as a non-member of the Quad, but join the coalition. And you can start to see this slowly spreading across. In many ways, when I've talked to Indian diplomats who are looking at this, they say our biggest problem is we're handling too many offers now. And we have to still get the basic core Quad moving in many ways. But keep this in mind, this is a plurilateral organization, if you wish. And it's very clear, it does not want to be a treaty organization. It does not want to be an alliance. It's a very different kind of non-Cold War structure. I was talking to Shinzo Abe's, the previous prime minister of Japan, his diplomatic advisor once, and he said, look, the Quad is going to be something that no textbook will understand. It's going to be a very different kind of international organization. The Quad will not necessarily always agree with itself. 3 members of the Quad may go off and decide to do something, and the 4th member says, I don't want to be part of this. So they'll be like, that's okay, that's fine. You go off and do what you want. Because if it's about technology, it cannot be treaty bound, because technology is simply too amorphous for us to be able to sit down and tighten it into little boxes and say only these countries can work with us. Some things like the green shipping network, China will have to help. I mean, China will have to be part of this, otherwise it won't work. So you have an interesting, but the standards set by the Quad, if China accepts them, will be definitely a plus. So it's a very interesting international structure. I agree with the professor that nobody has a real word for this. And it's because it's a very new kind of structure. And it represents the fact that geopolitics in the 21st century will revolve to a large extent about technology in a manner that it's never done so before. And if you look at, whenever I ask people, what about trade? And they said, trade is not the 21st century issue. Supply chains are the 21st century geopolitical issue. But supply chains are a very complicated structure A simple example, a vaccine, we believe we were the vaccine kings of the world because we produced most of the vaccines in the world. When we had a crisis and the world during the COVID situation, and we struggled, we discovered that no, far from being the kings of vaccines, we were the end of a supply chain that covered 40 countries and had 360 separate ingredients that were imported. Suddenly everybody looked at it and said, wow, far from being kings, it's all about supply chains. Multiply this across those almost 30 different technologies that have been decided by the Quad members as being strategically determinant in the future, you realize how difficult this is. And it's something, but each different segments of the Quad are moving at very different speeds. And it's going to take a while. But what you did correctly point out is the strength of the Chinese reaction to what the Quad is doing is a clear indication that the Chinese are nervous, because their belief is that if we can dominate future technologies, then China is in trouble.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Taking this particular aspect forward with you, Ambassador, these smaller segments, is that something that we need to focus on to help everyone along the way? Can it be done? And how can it be done?
So, Frank, look, of course, all of this has to be done. But, Pramit has made a very big and broad point. One of the things, of course, interesting, and Pramit, I hope you will, in a sense, at least accept it for whatever it's worth. Some of these things turn out to be coalitions of the willing. I join, eat my cake and have it too. But, on the other hand, around the core of the Quad, you can have Quad pluses in various things. Now, remember, on technology, some of the issues are not easy. They're not easy also to do because they are in the nature of competition. Let me give you a simple example. There was no movement on that entire business of IPR, whether it is right or wrong. There's been no movement. Other chaps just simply made noises. Let's also remember one thing, that even in the Indo-Pacific, it's the Chinese vaccines which everybody took, including Australia. And these are realities of life. So while the supply chain thing is certainly important, the fact is that we really are in no position to, compress the supply chains. And these are some of the things which are important. Now, where is India important? India is important because we are a producer of a large number of technically qualified people. So, that's our, in a sense, strength. Good Indians. And then they qualify better, do on and so forth. It's not just the few global CEOs, but the whole number of other people which we are able to produce. And there's some advantage to demography that we add to it, both in terms of a market and in terms of these things. So yes, all these things of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the Chinese being worried. Why not? Of course, they should be worried. Quietly for 20 years, they focused on technology. The big technology companies in the world found it very convenient. There was a market, there was a development perspective, and everything was going on fine. Those companies are realizing, because back home in their societies, there is an angst and there is an action. One of the few alternatives, not perhaps ready, nowhere perhaps ready. So I certainly do think that several of the smaller areas, the niche areas, will develop. And why not? And they should develop. If it results in a greater degree of harmonization, and so within this sort of agreed rules of competition we can't get rid of. There is a greater degree of, keeping in check hegemonistic action. Then to that extent and in that manner, the Quad would have said that, look, the 21st century is, of course, about hegemony, but not one about authoritarian physical hegemony. But, let's play the game and let's see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, very true. All right. Let me bring in another aspect now, Professor, and let's take that forward. Individually, on a bilateral level, all of these countries get along very well with each other. They are strategic partners. They have a robust relationship. But somehow when it comes to the Quad, when it comes to this particular plurilateral, they don't seem to be getting everything in order and moving with the best foot forward. Why is that so?
I think very clearly, if you heard Foreign Minister talking to the press yesterday, he said three things that define Quad. One is robust bilateral relations that you just underlined, strategic convergence, and shared values. And he meant democracy, basically. And that is the strength of these four countries coming together. But everybody understands what brings them together is their concern on China's rising footprint in the region. China is not just the largest trading partner and in very many cases investor in most of the littoral countries of both Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, so Indo-Pacific, but even these four countries. So even these four countries have enormous amount of trade and investment and technology transfers with Chinese. Look at your e-commerce in India, startups in India. So to me, that is what triggered them coming together, that they want to ensure certain socialization or certain restraint on China on so-called fair play and rules of law that mostly Western world has evolved since Second World War. I don't think they came together to sort of work together in AI or big data or technology, green technology or blue technologies. So that is an outcome of their coming together. The trigger for their coming together is China. And on China itself, look at all four meetings of foreign ministers and look at the statements they have made at end of those meetings. Invariably, United States is pushing much harsher line on China, particularly in Mike Pompeo's speeches. If you remember, he wanted to distinguish between the Communist Party of China and Chinese people. And then, they are two different entities in that sense for him. That kind of tone has not gone away. Joe Biden's policies, particularly on China, are same as Donald Trump's policies. Then you look at India on the other extreme, where India wants to keep also finger in the pie of Russia, China, India, wants to sustain that cooperation and relationship. China is today the largest trading partner of India, largest supplier of imports. And likewise, Australia to some extent may be a little tough once in a while, but also very, very reticent. And, they immediately resign to the fate when they face wolf warriors. Japan, again, has a dispute like India, boundary dispute. Japan is also often seen much cautious. So even on the core driver that brings them together, they have continuously had variations in their visions, which are publicly shared with press conferences at end of each of these four meetings. I'm sure differences are much starker when they are in closed door meetings, sitting together and talking to what they can and cannot say. And then, of course, this whole talk about Quad plus, what it means. I mean, it is an open house for anybody to come in and go, unless they show certain vision that they have, which demarcates them as a particular entity together. I don't think it makes any sense. Otherwise, they could have their technology transfers and cooperation at bilateral level as well. Or in several other forums. I mean, go to WTO and other forums where you can negotiate technology transfers and do other things. The purpose here is not climate change protection, terrorism, or other things like infrastructure building, capacity building, which these are issues which have been cropped up, and the sting, as I think Mr. Puri was saying, has been removed. It has gone to AUKUS. So what was it that Quad wanted to ultimately achieve and do together? To restrain China, to bring China to certain, rule of law, order, norms, etc., socialize China, etc. On that front, it appears, and that's why Chinese very often keep saying this is a group of four countries that don't see eye to eye with each other. Are these countries able to do things in Indo-Pacific or outline their vision about Indo-Pacific, which makes China look less attractive to the littoral nations? I don't think that is happening because China is constantly expanding its footprint in terms of its investments, trade, technology transfers, infrastructure building, and so on. Of course, there are several hiccups in those projects. All projects, even the best friends doing projects with each other. Look at China-Pakistan corridor is a great example of two friends raising 15,000 soldiers to protect those investments of Chinese. So, projects will always have hiccups. But the scale and speed is what you need to notice. Is Quad doing something to either match up to that speed or streamline that speed in a certain direction where they want to? They keep talking of quality control, rule, regulations, these things, but are they delivering on the ground? I think we want to now see them coming out with action plans, coming out with certain projects, putting deadlines. This is what they're doing. What is a meeting? A meeting has to be of stock taking. What is the stock taking? What they are telling, what they have achieved so far. They are only saying they want to do this. They wish things would be like this and that. This talk about constant protection of sovereignty, observation of rules, these things beyond a point begin to look like lip service. And therefore, I think if Quad, the kind of ambitious project they have in front of them of stopping the juggernaut of China's economic investments and engagements in the region, there is stronger expectation than helping Tonga in crisis.
Absolutely, absolutely. Points very well taken, Professor.
Very,
All
very
right.
well said.
Yes, absolutely. All right, time to get quick closing comments now with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Pramit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all in agreement that the Quad has to deliver. That's the primary thing that's been done. Keep in mind that the Quad in its present form is a very recent development. One of the reasons it's holding 2 to 3 summits every year is because they're all fast as much as they can. One of the good things that if you get briefings, as I do regularly, on what happens behind closed doors, what's striking for me is how much they moved forward. That when the first Quad summits were held just a few years ago, I mean, I'm not talking about the original humanitarian developed Quad, there was zero agreement among the 4 members. Now there is striking degree of agreement, especially with the switch of Australia, which in many ways was the most reluctant country within the Quad to take on China, partly because, as Dr. Singh has mentioned, the enormous economic, I mean, it's not just a trade, and it's an trade, investment, everything on an overwhelming scale between Australia and China. China is their #1 economic partner even today. You still see, now there's a degree of convergence. Now the game is to deliver, and that's going to take a lot of time. But I think we're now going to see this summit, the next summit will be held probably in May, but I suspect there'll be yet another summit before the end of the year, which is a relatively fast track by international diplomatic standards. And I think that having made the clear global promise on COVID vaccines, even though the Indo-Pacific region itself no longer requires that many vaccines, because most of these countries have been able to either ride out a COVID situation or vaccinate their populations. India, for example, defines Africa, especially the Indian Ocean part, littoral side of Africa, as part of the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, we still have, in Africa, it remains only 5% vaccination rates. So we still have a market for that. The issue of boosters remains. Most countries still want to go for boosters. So you still have a perfect market or place for those vaccines to continue. And I think that is a necessary first step. But yes, delivery is the key. But delivery in the Quad, and I stress this, is going to be very different. And the Quad recognizes this from what other multilateral organizations have been doing.
Absolutely. Ambassador.
Thank you, Frank. I think, one must agree with what Professor Swan Singh has basically said. If I give an analogy of a football match, I mean, everybody knows where the goal has to be scored, but basically there's a very strong team in front of you, a very, very strong team. You're basically passing the ball and trying to declare victory. Now, look, this is an idea, but let me give you a corollary, completely different one. You remember a decade odd back, everybody was running around a thing called BRICS. Do you hear anything about it? So, is it going to go forward? I don't know. One of the things is, why do things like NATO, etc., the few sort of success stories, they have a focused, very simple set of objectives. And everybody is focused on that, and on that there is no deviation. Now here that focus set has gone, and so now you have a much broader set of things, of the way the world will do things. And so therefore, it's a tough call. If it happens that Pramit says in a different way, I'll be very happy. But generally speaking, I haven't seen the world acting very differently from the times that Westphalia came into being. So we'll have to see. But it's a good idea that 4 large democracies and large economies get together and meet. This in itself, A, signals, and B, I think for one of them, at least India, this is a good sign of cooperation, even bilaterally and within this grouping. And those are opportunities for us. And so therefore, it's worth playing this game and taking it forward.
Absolutely. And Professor, close the show for us with your quick concluding remarks.
Thank you, Frank. I think as Ambassador Puri just mentioned, these are 4 very powerful economies, powerful democracies, powerful militaries. So expectations from them are obviously very different. So, instead of emphasizing on robust bilateral relations, they have to now begin to look at themselves as a minilateral, driven by a certain, objective in certain, urgency of what they want to attend to and achieve. And in that sense, what the Indian foreign minister said very clearly, it is a grouping which is aimed to doing something together, not against somebody. So in that sense, I think particularly United States should stop treating it as a platform to sort of criticize China or sort of do name calling on China, and look at what can be achieved together. Because once that shrill kind of American tone comes into these deliberations, this clearly makes these middle powers far more reluctant about joining that chorus. And that is what Beijing keeps telling us, that these are dispirited countries, they don't have any unison among themselves. So America must realize this is not a platform to sort of follow anti-China tone. Here they have to be far more optimistic, positive, proactive in terms of what they wish to achieve together. And four of them have enormous credibility in the region, and Littoral would definitely engage them in a very, very different way than they engage China, which offers huge turnkey projects with all kinds of debt traps and other issues. They have credibility. They need to work as a minilateral rather than a combination of bilaterals. And I think that kind of evolution is something that is urgent and important, I think. And that is which will make them really far more, draw your line longer rather than trying to deal with the Chinese line, rubbing that off or cleaning it. Once they begin to move forward together in being one minilateral, unity is very, very clear and visible in their statements and action plans. It will be easier because most of the countries in the littoral, as I keep saying, would engage these Quad much better. They can have other friends and allies coming together, going out and doing other things in various specific sectors. But are these four countries standing for something clearly defined as their vision for Indo-Pacific, and how they wish to ensure that security, prosperity, and openness and fair play in the Indo-Pacific? And that has to be really outlined in one voice. And I think that is what is the need of the hour.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Well, what's coming out of this discussion is that the theme and objective is very clear: to take on the hegemony of China. The Quad has been high on lip service and low on delivery, though. There is immense potential in the Quad, and that is what China is really concerned about. But rather than focusing on issues that matter to them individually the most, it is important to have a united vision as far as the plurilateral is concerned. There is still no clarity on whether the Quad is an organization, treaty, alliance, or grouping. The role has to be defined, and there is a need for a focused set of deliverables like the success story, NATO, rather than something like BRICS that no one even is talking about these days. However, the Quad has come a long way since its first meeting, where there was zero agreement between the partners. It is now time to take it up a notch and work with a much higher degree of convergence. Now, before I go, let me once again remind you to like the video, subscribe, and share the content as well, so that more people get to know about Bharata First. Do subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive information. And how can I not tell you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center, our big success story? It is your one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. We now have 26 amazing courses all put together to help you in your competitive exams and also make you better Bharatiyas. Live classes for the second phase have begun. Do ensure that you register now and participate in the interactive sessions. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com for more details. Hundreds are reaping the benefits of the Knowledge Center. Don't be left behind. Don't regret later. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. That's it from me. See you again next time.